because Paul had a particular purpose, that God had a particular purpose for Paul, and that was that Paul would go to Rome and share the gospel with both kings as well as those guards and so on that were with him. And so we're going to continue this morning as we follow in Paul's journey to Rome. And we're going to now, we remember last week we studied as Felix was kind of putting off the trying of Paul. He never did. After 2 years of having Paul in custody, where it really wasn't in prison, as it were, he was more in a house arrest, gave him some amount of flexibility, and yet he didn't let him free. He held on to him. He knew that this was a kind of hot button issue, and he didn't want to have the Jews kill him and have this uprising and have a problem because of he was appointed as governor and he needed to keep the peace, whatever that means. He needed to keep them from having this uprising. And so through that time, he left Paul in prison. And part of the reason we read in the end of chapter 24 was that he wanted to please the Jews. He wanted to please the Jews so that there wasn't a problem. He wanted, it was kind of like, you don't cause any problems for me, and I won't let Paul go free, even though we saw that he didn't believe Paul had done anything worthy of death, or really imprisonment. And so then at the very end of chapter 24, we saw that Felix was replaced by Festus. And so that's where we pick it up this morning. And I just want us to observe that there's really kind of 4 scenes. If you were going to make a movie or make put this on as a play, there would be 4 scenes going on here this morning. And maybe there's a little bit of continuity between a couple of them. But the first one is we see Festus in Jerusalem with the Jewish leaders. And next we see Paul before Festus in Caesarea. And then we see Festus conferring with Agrippa and Bernice. And then we see Paul come before Festus, Agrippa, and Bernice. And so we're going to begin our reading there in verse 1 and just kind of walk through this section together. Now 3 days after Festus had arrived in the province, he went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. And the chief priests and the principal men of the Jews laid out their case against Paul, and they urged him, asking as a favor against Paul that he summon him to Jerusalem, because they were planning an ambush to kill him on the way. Festus replied that Paul was being kept at Caesarea and that he himself intended to go there shortly. So said he, let the men of authority among you go down with me, and if there is anything wrong about the man, let them bring their charges against him. It's kind of interesting here. Festus gets into office, so to speak, and it's just after a couple of days, he leaves and he goes down to Jerusalem. Now, why did he go to Jerusalem? Well, this was really the biggest and most important city of the province that he was governing. He was a governor appointed by Rome to govern, and yet even though was stationed at Caesarea, he went down to Jerusalem because that's where the action was. And that's really where, again, these governors were charged with keeping the peace, Pax Romana, the Roman peace. And so he needed to go down there and check things out, what's going on, and make sure that there was no risk of an uprising, maybe put a face to the name so that they would know who was governing them, maybe see who would grease his palm so that he would, be easy on them, whatever. And so, and when he goes down there, we see the chief priests and the principal men of the Jews came to him. Now, it turns out that in all likelihood, this was a different chief priest than was there when Paul had been, threatened to be killed or attacked there in the temple that day. This was another chief priests. They'd have been appointed probably by Herod Agrippa II. And so what we see here is that after 2 years of Paul being in Caesarea in house arrest, and then now, you have a new chief priest there, and yet what are the Jews going to do? Not only do they lay out their case against him, they want Paul brought to Jerusalem. But why did they want Paul brought to Jerusalem? Did they want to try him and then, put him to death for his crimes? No, that's not what it says. It says they made that as an excuse because they were planning an ambush to kill Paul on the way. Sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? It's pretty much exactly what they were planning to do before. They wanted to kill Paul. They didn't want to have a fair trial because they knew that Paul wasn't guilty. They wanted to just ambush him and kill him. Now, you'll remember also that last week there were these, or maybe it was a few weeks ago, I don't remember exactly, all kinds of runs together eventually, but there were these 40 plus men who had taken a vow to kill Paul. Remember those guys? Well, here it is 2 years later, and they're either starved to death or they broke their vow. They probably broke their vow, but so, for whatever reason, you would think that they would kind of forget about Paul and go about their business. But no, they didn't forget about Paul. Paul was influential, and they had continued to see the influence of Paul through the Christians, even in Jerusalem. And so it made a big difference to them whether Paul continued to live or not. They needed to put an end to this Christian thing, and they thought that by killing Paul, they would put an end to it. Of course, we know that in the past, people had been put to death. Remember earlier in the book of Acts where Stephen was put to death. And we know that didn't put an end to this Jesus thing, this the way. Or later on, we saw the apostle James be put to death. That didn't put an end to it. No way was this going to, by killing Paul, was it going to put an end to it. In fact, a lot of times what happens is when you kill someone, they become a martyr, and they become, it causes an uprising of that, whatever it is. But this is very different because people weren't just, following the way of Jesus because people had been killed. They were following the way of Jesus because they knew Jesus to be true, to be alive. So at any rate, we see, Festus here, and he said, he responded to these chief priests and the elders of the Jews. Paul is being kept at Caesarea. And I'm going to go back to Caesarea shortly, so why don't you send, whoever it is that is men of authority, go down with me, and then we can see about if there's anything wrong about Paul. You can bring your charges. So that's the first scene of this chapter in those 5 verses. Then we go on in verse 6. And he stayed among them not more than 8 to 10 days. He went down to Caesarea, and the next day he took his seat on the tribunal and ordered Paul to be brought. So he's somehow, keeping his word. He went back to Caesarea, and now he's going to have Paul come out. Apparently they went with him. He says, when he had arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many and serious charges against him that they could not prove. Now it's interesting, Luke is, just avoiding repeating everything. Luke has recorded what the charges were and what they were saying, but Luke just kind of shorthands it this time and just says, apparently they talked for a long time. They brought many charges, and they were serious charges, but they couldn't prove them. So Paul argued in his defense, neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I committed any offense. And again, Luke doesn't go into great detail here of what Paul said. Paul just said, I haven't done anything. I haven't done anything against the Jews. I haven't done anything against the temple, and I haven't done anything against Caesar. In verse 9, but Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, do you wish to go up to Jerusalem and there be tried on these charges before me? Now, truth be known, Festus was probably hoping that Paul would say yes, so that he could, say, well, Paul chose to go back to Jerusalem to go on trial there. He didn't want, Paul was like the hot potato. The hot potato where you toss it to somebody else because it's hot, and they toss it to somebody else because it's hot. And Paul answered and said, I am standing before Caesar's tribunal where I ought to be tried. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as you yourself know very well. If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything for which I deserve to die, I do not seek to escape death. But if there is nothing to their charges against me, no one can give me up to them. I appeal to Caesar. See, Paul, again, was a Roman citizen. Excuse me. And Paul, again, appeals to the rights as a Roman citizen. He says, I haven't done anything to them. I am, before Caesar's tribunal where I belong. This is where I should be tried. I haven't done anything to the Jews. And then he says, and you yourself know very well. I wonder if Paul was just surmising that, or if because Felix had said he didn't find anything worthy of prison or death. We haven't really heard Festus give a declaration on that yet. Paul says, you yourself know very well. And then Paul says, it's not that I want to escape death. If I'm guilty of something worthy of death, then I'm not trying to escape. But he's appealing to what is just, because he says, I haven't actually done anything wrong. And he appeals to Caesar. Now, I don't know if you realize this or not, but Caesar at the time was Nero. Caesar was just a title, and the Caesar at the time was Nero. Well, Festus answers him. When he had conferred with his council, he answered, to Caesar you have appealed, to Caesar you shall go. So, even though Festus wanted to kind of hand this problem off back to the Jews, he's happy enough to have Paul go on to Caesar instead of, him having to decide this case himself. So that's the end of the second scene, as it were, in the chapter. And then we have verse 13. Now, when some days had passed, Agrippa the king and Bernice arrived at Caesarea and greeted Festus. I just want to pause there and note that Agrippa was Herod Agrippa II. And he was, king of the region. He was a really Jewish leader, and he was allowed to be king by the Romans. So it was, the Romans were governing and allowing the, Herod to rule. And so then we go on. He said, and he had stayed there. And as they stayed there many days, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, there is a man left prisoner by Felix. So, this again, he's trying to pass the buck, trying to put this under, Herod's, make this Herod's problem. And also he says, I didn't do anything. I just inherited this problem. Felix left him a prisoner. And when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews laid out their case against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation against him. And I answered them that it was not the custom of the Romans to give up anyone before the accused met the accusers face to face and had the opportunity to make his defense concerning the charge laid against him. We've seen that before where the Romans wanted to allow the case to be made instead of just, judge him immediately or turn him over. Verse 17, so when they came together here, I made no delay, but on the next day took my seat on the tribunal and ordered the man to be brought. And when the accusers stood up, they brought no charge in his case of such evils as I supposed. I thought they were going to say all these horrible things, but they really didn't. They didn't have anything on him. Rather, they had certain points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who was dead, but whom Paul asserted to be alive. Being at a loss how to investigate these questions, I asked whether he wanted to go to Jerusalem and be tried there regarding them. But when Paul had appealed to be kept in custody for the decision of the emperor, I ordered him to be held until I could send him to Caesar. So he's explaining the problem, but really he's handing the problem, trying to hand the problem off to Herod Agrippa II. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I would like to hear the man myself. Tomorrow, said he, you will hear him. So that's the end of the third scene that we have here in this chapter. And just want to, we'll come back to this a little bit later, but I just want to take note of what he says about the accusers and about Paul. The accusers had no charge, no real charge. Their real dispute was about their own religion and about this Jesus who was dead and Paul claimed was alive. But he says, a certain Jesus. It's like Festus doesn't know who Jesus is. Festus had come from Rome. He had been appointed to be governor here. And so he's just kind of, pushed into this situation. And whoever this Jesus is, Festus could have asked who Jesus was. We don't read that Festus even asked Paul, who is this Jesus that you claim to be alive? I mean, wouldn't that become like the center point of your thinking, of your focus, if you had found out that Paul claimed that this Jesus who was dead was now alive? Wouldn't that wouldn't that alarm you? Wouldn't you want to know more about that? Apparently Festus really didn't care about that. He just wanted to get this problem off his hands. He wanted to do whatever he had to do to keep the peace and possibly to bribe the Jews. Well, verse 23, so on the next day, Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp, and they entered the audience hall with the military tribunes and the prominent men of the city. Then at the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. And Festus said, King Agrippa and all who are present with us, you see this man about whom the whole Jewish people petitioned me, both in Jerusalem and here, shouting that he ought not to live any longer, but I found that he has done nothing deserving death. And as he himself appealed to the emperor, I decided to go ahead and send him. But I have nothing definite to write to my Lord about him. Therefore, I have brought him before you all, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after we have examined him, I may have something to write. For it seemed to me unreasonable in sending a prisoner not to indicate the charges against him. And so he, what he's saying there is, I need to tell Nero, I need to write Nero. Why is it I'm sending Paul to you? What are the charges against him? So that's what I'm looking to do here. but he's really putting it on King Agrippa to investigate, to question, to find out what's going on. But again, we see that important note there. I found that he had done nothing deserving death. I don't know what they're really accusing him of. The charges don't appear to stick. And I don't want to send him to Nero with a bunch of, gobbledygook. I want to send him with true charges. I don't want Nero to come and do to me what he did to Festus. Felix, excuse me. Get the names mixed up. Well, as we look at this passage this morning, I just want to step back, and we're going to do this by looking at who are the players involved, who are the people, the characters in this play. And first, of course, we have Festus. He was this Roman governor over the region. And he was looking for a way to curry favor with the Jews in order to keep the peace. He just wanted he just didn't want to deal with problems. He wanted the problems to go away. And then we have Herod Agrippa II. He was this Jewish king ruling over the Jews. And interestingly enough, this Bernice that he was with, was his sister. And it turns out he was married to her. So I guess he gives new meaning to sister wife. Anyway, think about, maybe you recognize the name Herod Agrippa, or Herod. Herod Agrippa II was from a long line of murderous rulers. His great-grandfather was Herod the Great. Herod the Great was the one that had heard that there was going to be a baby born, and he sent the wise men to find him. And of course, his purpose was that he might kill him, because he didn't want another king to be there. He didn't want his authority to be somehow threatened. And then when the wise men didn't return to him, what did he do? He ordered all the babies under the age of 2 to be killed. This was this guy's great-grandfather. And then we have his Herod the Great's son, Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas was the one who had John the Baptist beheaded. Of course, there's a little bit more to that story. He was John the Baptist was speaking out against Herod Antipas, and so eventually, when it became convenient, he decided to have John the Baptist killed as a birthday present for his daughter. And of course, later he participated in the trials of Jesus. And then we have Herod Agrippa I. And Herod Agrippa I is the one that had James killed, the Apostle James. And so now here we have Herod Agrippa II, and you just look at the heritage that's been left to him. A bloody, murderous heritage. And of course, he really, Paul really wasn't going to be in good hands as far as being held liable under Herod Agrippa II. But then we have Paul. And Paul is here, and he's just kind of almost a prop at this point. I mean, he's this whole thing is going on around him. And he's been there for 2 years in house arrest. But what is Paul thinking during this time? Just imagine what Paul is thinking. What was Paul's purpose? What was his intent? What was Paul about? Well, we know that from the time that Paul was saved, Paul was about sharing the gospel, sharing the good news of Jesus and the resurrection and what that means for us if we accept him, or what that means for us if we don't. Remember, the just and the unjust will be raised. We have this history of Paul with what his purpose is. You know, the Lord had told, had said what Paul's, back to Ananias, when Paul had gone, to Damascus, and the Lord had said to him, go find him, even though Ananias was like, I know this Saul, he's killing Christians. He's bringing them back to put him in prison. He says, go, for he is a chosen instrument of mine to carry my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel. And there's three groups of people there. The Gentiles. Paul had spent his entire missionary journeys bringing the gospel to the Gentiles. Of course, he did not cease to also preach to the children of Israel, to the Jews. But now he has another part of that journey is to bring the gospel to kings, to rulers, to maybe governors, to King Agrippa, to Nero, to whoever is there along the way. For I will show him how much he must suffer for the sake of my name. And so there's kind of two things there. I have him to, share my name before these people, but he's going to suffer along the way. And so, of course, we see that carrying out here. And then in Acts chapter 19, you'll remember when Paul was in Ephesus and various things were going on. And this was right before a riot in Ephesus. And after these events, Paul resolved in the Spirit to pass through Macedonia and Achaia and go to Jerusalem, saying, after I have been there, I must also see Rome. And so Paul, in his spirit, knew that he was going to see Rome. He planned to see Rome. And we see that a couple chapters later, in chapter 23, remember how after Paul was in prison, after all that had happened, the Jews trying to kill him and being rescued by the Romans, well, the following night the Lord stood by him and said, take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome. Paul had an appointment. He was appointed. He was sent for a purpose. And we know that part of that purpose, after he had shared the gospel with the Gentiles and the Jews, was now to carry the name of the Lord before kings, to go back to Rome. But Paul has been in this house arrest for 2 years. Can you imagine what's going through his mind? I don't know, if it were me, I'd be, well, Lord, you told me I was going to go back to Rome. I'm just sitting here. I mean, I'd be like, come on, Lord, maybe you want me to figure out how to get to Rome. Maybe I'd be planning and plotting. We do that, don't we? We think the Lord wants something, and so we plan and plot. And we figure out how to accomplish what the Lord wants. I don't think Paul was doing that. I think he was sharing the gospel with those around him, knowing that when it was time, that the Lord would accomplish what he wanted to accomplish. I say that because we see that in the character of Paul. He trusted God. But we have another important character. We not only have Festus and Agrippa and Paul, just as in the book of Esther, we have this hidden actor. God's name is never named in the book of Esther. And yet, what we see in the book of Esther is Mordecai and Esther acting in a faithfulness to God. And we read that verse that we all love to pull out and quote, for such a time as this, you were born. You were born when you were born for a specific purpose. And Esther's purpose was being fulfilled at that point in time through the choices that she had to make. Well, now in Paul's life, there is this hidden actor. This God is controlling, he's influencing, he's orchestrating the events on the stage of history. This drama that we see unfolding to accomplish this plan that he's already made known. And he's laid it out. And he's going to send Paul to Rome in his time. And I was thinking through this this morning. Jesus constantly said to his disciples, the time is not yet, or the time is approaching. He as he went through his ministry and as he approached the time when he knew that he was going to die, he used this term repeatedly about the time, the appointed time. The purpose for which he was sent was going to be fulfilled at a specific time. And then on that night, he said, the time is here. And he went to the cross. And I think that's probably how Paul approached this. The time is coming when I'm going to go to Rome. And maybe, Jesus had more insight into what the time was. Maybe Paul didn't yet know what the time was when he was going to go, but he knew the time was approaching. He knew that the culmination of his calling was on its way, was coming. Then I was thinking there's a difference between how Jesus handled his trials as the time arrived for him to die than the way Paul is handling his trials. You remember one thing that the Old Testament prophesies about Jesus, that he opened not his mouth. Jesus did not offer a defense. He went to the cross as a lamb before her shears is dumb, so he opened not his mouth. Yes, he said some words, but he wasn't defending himself. He was leaving it out there. They could find him guilty, even though he wasn't guilty. But he knew that his purpose was to die. His purpose was not to live and go on and, minister. No, his purpose was to die. Paul's purpose was not merely to die. Paul's purpose was to go to Rome and bring the gospel to kings. And we know that one of the things Paul did was he brought the gospel to the palace. He brought the gospel through those who were guarding him. His purpose was not merely to die. He would die. That would be the end result. So he offered a defense for himself because it wasn't time yet for him to die. Stephen also offered a defense. Stephen's defense was really the truth of the gospel. One of the things that Paul didn't try to plan and plot and take this into his own hands. And I think back to the times we read in the Old Testament where people took things into their own hands. And while I'm kind of going through a couple of these, just be thinking about, do we take things into our own hands when we think God's purpose is, whatever it is, whatever we think? Do we take things into our hands and try to work those things out? Do we try to solve the problems ourselves, or are we trusting in him? Remember Moses, after he was raised in Pharaoh's court, virtually in his family, and then Later on, he knew that God was going to use him to deliver Israel. And what did he do? He saw the Egyptian guards being cruel to his kinsmen, the Jews, and he killed one of the guards. Of course, then the next day, he saw a couple of the Jews fighting and quarreling, and he tried to get them to stop. Why are you fighting? You shouldn't be fighting each other. And they looked at him and said, who are you to tell us? Are you going to kill us like you killed the Egyptian? And suddenly Moses realized he had been found out. His sin, his evil wasn't a secret. And so, but he had tried to take this into his own hands, and he ended up running out into the wilderness. And God virtually had to come to him in the burning bush and then retrain him for 40 years. Even Abraham. Think about the ways that Abraham tried to take things into his own hands. There were multiple times when, now Sarah was Abraham's half-sister, if you'll remember, but when he was asked by kings, who is this? And he didn't even, maybe they didn't even ask, he just introduced her as a sister, instead of introducing her as his wife, putting her in danger, actually, because they would think, oh, she's beautiful, I'll take her for my wife. And if he had told them that she was his wife, then they wouldn't have done that. He was afraid they would kill him, but he didn't trust God. He took it into his own hands, multiple occasions. And then, of course, after God had promised that he would have a son, that he would have Isaac, what did Abraham do when he saw Sarah was old and she couldn't bear children? And so he took Hagar, her handmaiden, and he had a child with Hagar. He took things into his own hands. He didn't trust God. I'm sure there are many other examples. Jonah's a little bit different, but Jonah kind of took things into his own hands. He didn't want to obey God. Don't we do that? Don't we take things into our own hands instead of trusting in him? But we'll close with some verses. I'll read one verse, and I'm sure you'll recognize it. This is probably really a verse that describes Paul. Therefore, my beloved brethren, Paul wrote, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain. Of course, we love that verse. Gives us confidence to continue doing what we know is right, to be immovable, to continue working, knowing that the Lord's going to prosper what we do, not because of us, but because we're working for him. Do you know where that verse is found? Do you know what the context of that verse is? Context is in 1 Corinthians 15. It's the end of the chapter that we call the resurrection chapter. I'll go back a few verses and read the preceding verses there. And Paul writes after, talking all about the resurrection, he says, behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed. Just have to tell you that verse was posted outside the nursery in a church that I grew up in. We shall not all sleep, we shall all be changed. Anyway, the babies obviously had to all be changed. Anyway. We shall not all sleep, we shall all be changed in the moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we shall be changed. For this perishable body must put on the imperishable, and the mortal puts on immortality. Then shall come to pass the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting? The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. But thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. Therefore, my beloved brethren, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain. You see, the whole thing was rooted in the resurrection, the very thing for which Paul believed he was, that was the thing that he raised. He said in a previous trial, he said, all I've said is that Jesus rose again. And he really didn't say Jesus rose again. He talked about the resurrection, and that's where he talked about the resurrection of the just and the unjust. See, because Jesus rose again, we will rise again. That's what he's saying here. That day will come. And so knowing that that day will come, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor shall not be in vain. And so that is what Paul was thinking. Paul had already written this to the Corinthians before this trial was occurring. And so that was what Paul was thinking. Here I am in the midst of this. I know that one day I will be raised. I will be resurrected. And because of that, I'm going to continue immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord. I'm going to continue being steadfast because my labor is not in vain. My labor in the Lord. So we should remember during our struggles, during our difficulty, that in that verse of 181 we sang this morning. I have to open it because I won't quote it right. Jesus knows all about our struggles. He will guide until the day is done. He will take care of it. He will work things out. Our labor is not in vain in the Lord. We need to trust him. It just sounds so easy. It's almost trite to say. We need to trust him. What does trust him mean? It means not try to take things into our hands and work them out, but to just continue serving him, continue sharing the gospel, continue doing what we're called to do in the face of difficulties and struggles, whether we're being, sent to Rome ultimately to be killed like Paul was, which is doubtful to happen to any of us, or whether it's illness or loss of job or loss of a loved one, or whatever challenges we face, physical illness. We need to continue being steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord. Let's close in a word of prayer together.